So at the very beginning, you mentioned something that was interesting to me. So you mentioned that you used to work in academia and now you work in industry. That's actually not the part that I found interesting. It wasn't that you did your PhD and then said, "Oh, this is not for me. I'm going to go into industry," or then did your postdoc and said, "This is not for me. I went into industry." You actually ran like the full gauntlet. You became a professor. You sort of got to the place that every aspiring academic is aiming for. And then you made the transition. So can you talk to us about how that happened and why you made that choice?
Yeah, it was really interesting. And it was literally 1 month after I was notified that I was promoted to professor that I handed in my notice. And it shocked a lot of people. And I don't want to get too personal about it, but I definitely feel like I had run my course with academia. I love research. I absolutely love research. And I love working with students. But there is a certain slowness to academic research that I found quite frustrating. So things don't really move at much of a pace in some area, not for everybody. And I felt like I could make a difference, a bigger difference somewhere else. And there were other aspects of academia that were bothering me. And I thought that when I was made professor that it would make me feel differently about the university, but it didn't. And for me, that was the point at which I knew I really have to go and do something different, because I thought, this hasn't made me feel more in love with academia. And I thought it would. I've gotten to the point where I thought I, wanted to be, but actually, I really do want to go out there. I want to do something different from a personal challenge point of view. But I also want to feel like I'm making more of a difference. And I think I didn't feel like I was making enough of a difference in academia because, your time is always torn between so many other endeavors. When you're an academic, you're a teacher, you're a mentor, you're a HR expert, you manage budgets, you're, trying to do your research, you're trying to be collegiate, running timetables, modules. You're just being torn all the time. And I felt like I would rather be more research focused and actually not have some of those challenges on my time. So yeah, they were the things that motivated me to want to leave. And I also thought, well, I have enough time in me that I could make a start on a new career. I think I felt that if I stayed any longer, I would never leave. So that felt like a good time to go. And then the other big thing that was happening at the same time, which was very serendipitous, was that there was just this, I feel, a huge sea change in all things to do with cannabis. So in the last five years, at least in the UK, we have seen things change at such a rate. We've changed the law about medicinal cannabis. There's been a real change in public perception and acceptance about the therapeutic utility of cannabis. There's been a real flurry of companies that are interested in doing cannabinoid research. 20 years ago, there was none of this. 15 years ago, people were not interested in talking to me about cannabinoid science. Whereas now, you've suddenly become really popular because you know about a topic that is having a heyday. And so I felt like there was a wave and I wanted to be on that wave from a different angle, that I wanted to be part of the movement and that maybe a different place to do that was in a commercial setting. So all of those things kind of happened at the same time, and probably in a different set of circumstances I would have stayed, but it just seemed right at the time. So I decided to go out by myself and do consulting, because I had already been doing some consulting on the side, because some companies had been approaching me for advice because I did gut work and stroke work and cancer work, and so I was giving advice to people, and so I already had my foot in the door, and I thought, well, I can do more of this, and let's see how it goes.
So let's talk about consulting for a second, because it can be this sort of this amorphous thing. You say, I'm consulting for people. I'm like, are they literally calling you on the phone and saying, tell us about how THCV works, please? Maybe for the people that might be academics now that might be curious about consulting, can you give us an example of like a representative consulting project? What are you actually doing and delivering?
It was really interesting because I wasn't sure what I'd end up doing. But the typical thing that people wanted from me was to know what the evidence base was. So they might have a particular compound that they were, they owned or they were interested in licensing. And so they would want me to say, call a compound X. They would say, tell me about compound X. What is the science behind it? What does the evidence show? What would be a good home for this compound? Like what indication, what disease should we be thinking about? What would a clinical trial look like? So sometimes I'm saying, okay, well, this is what your trial should look like. These are the patients you might want to do. So it's that kind of whole, looking at the evidence base and giving advice on how you could potentially move that compound into a clinic. Mm-hmm. Or it could be just about a disease area and what the general evidence is for cannabinoids in a particular disease area, and then helping people, understand what the right compounds might be by knowing the science and the mechanism of action of lots of different compounds. And you can figure out, okay, in acute kidney disease, it's really CB2 that you want to be targeting. Mm-hmm. However, whatever you do, however your compound works, so this is the molecular target, so this is what you want to do. So a lot of the research was, a lot of the work that I did was kind of commissioned reports like that, where I would, really get nitty gritty into the science of what was already published and put it all together for them and present options to them about, how they might go forward. Sometimes it was just about education. So going into companies and teaching them the basics of cannabinoids, about how they work, the history of them, all the different ways that they're different, like how we started this conversation today. But just like really giving them that cannabinoid 101 is quite important to people who've never worked in this area before. It's a complex area. And so having somebody who is an expert who can kind of break it down for them was something that was, really worthwhile doing. I also did a lot like talks for people. So going into, on their behalf, speaking to societies or at conferences, at organized events where I would go and do education pieces on, any of those above things. So there were lots of different, maybe talking to the media. I'm trying to think of what some of the things that I've done.
But if I could summarize so far, what you are telling us in effect is that as a biologist with your kind of background, you are getting paid professionally to read, comprehend, and summarize the literature for people, and to give talks, educational talks to people.
Yeah.
So a subset of the things that an academic would already be doing.
Yeah, exactly. So I wasn't doing anything different than my skill sets. But what was different is that you're putting a commercial spin on it. Mm-hmm. So sometimes I'd be looking at what the competition is. Who else is out there doing this? What clinical trials are being run already? What companies are out there doing what? So sometimes it's, it's more commercial than that. But I've got to read more in the last couple of years than I think I did in the last 10 years in academia, mm-hmm. when I was doing research as an academic. I've actually probably learned a lot more in the last 2 years about areas that I never worked in before. So I feel like I have a much broader understanding now than I ever did. So it's been really great. I've definitely found it really educational, and I've really enjoyed it. And what I found is that there are people out there who want expertise like this. I've never had to advertise. Mm-hmm. I've never, really, it just kind of word of mouth. I'll get a phone call from somebody saying, oh, I hear that you can give advice on this kind of thing. And that's how it's happened. So it was an interesting journey, but I have now taken a permanent role so one of the companies for whom I was doing science advising for the longest, probably for 4 years, is a small biotech company called Artello Biosciences. And they recently offered me a permanent role. And so I'm now working for them, not on a full-time basis, but almost full-time, but doing the same thing. So really being that translational, expert about helping turning science into medicines, knowing all that nitty-gritty cannabinoid background that's in my brain from the last 20 years and using all that knowledge to help them move their products forward in their development plan. So that is great for me because it's real, it's tangible. There are medicines being made, there are trials being done, and there are hopefully people who are going to benefit from it. And that was always what my goal was. And I feel like now I'm possibly getting to that point quicker than I would have done in academia.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier the slowness of academia, and you touched on right after that, getting pulled in so many different directions with so many different responsibilities, scientific, administrative, and otherwise. Is that where the slowness comes from? What do you think causes this sort of the pace of academic science? What's your diagnosis there?
I think it is all of those things. I think that getting the kind of funding that you need to do fast-moving research is difficult. I was never a massively successful grant awardee. I did get money through my time, definitely, but I wasn't one of these people who was getting £1 million grants. So I was always looking for money. I could have done bigger, better research had I had infinite, funds available to me. And I'm sure every academic would say the same thing. So that was always a massive rate limiting factor, that you were doing things not as fast, or using the latest technology. I went into a clinical research organization a couple of weeks ago. So this is somebody who we pay to do our research now. The machines and the technology that they have, and the high throughputness, if that's a word, of some of the stuff that they're doing is unbelievable. Academia just can't compete with that. You can screen your compounds so fast with some of the technology they have. And there we are in my lab with these old, plate readers that are 20 years old, and the one PCR machine, and, 2 cell culture hoods that everybody's fighting over. It just, it just can be a different world. And I think that there's a lot of, brilliant people in academia who would have made bigger and better discoveries if they had just been easier, and they had more funds available to them.
Do you think, this is do you think I don't mean this in the sense of there shouldn't be people getting this type of training as much as possible, but do you think there are too many science PhDs in the sense of there are too many people fighting for the same finite pool of resources, and that paradoxically you might actually be able to move faster if you were able to get more funding per lab?
I don't know. That's really interesting. I mean, I'd hate to say that there's too many people being trained, because, everybody who has a good scientific mind should be using it. I think there's limited resources. I think, I think I'd blame that one before I'd blame there being too many people. But I understand where you're coming from. There are currently way more brilliant people out there than there is funding. I mean, if you are somebody who's writing grants, most of the time you're getting a grant rejection. The feedback is, this is a great study, but it's just not a priority. So the problem is you're putting your science in there with other great scientists, and it began to feel like you had no control over whether you got funding anymore. Being an excellent scientist just wasn't good enough anymore, because everybody is excellent. So you're in a pool full of people who are scoring really highly. Everybody's scoring really highly. So what differentiates you? And 10 years ago, as a cannabinoid scientist, we weren't getting a lot of funding. So that might be different for me now if I was in academia, where I'm suddenly working in an area that's more sexy than it was 10 years ago. So it could be different for people in this space now. But I know a lot of brilliant cannabinoid scientists who pretty much left doing cannabinoid research about 10 years ago because it was just too hard to get funding in that area, because people didn't really see it going anywhere. So I think there's just not enough resources out there for people. I did see another interesting conundrum similar to the one that you put to me recently on Twitter, where somebody said, if there was less science out there, we'd be able to concentrate on the science, the little science that was being produced better. But because there's so much science being produced and published all the time, we can't keep track of it. And we're missing some of the gems because of the sheer volume of research.
Did you, on that note, did you see the recent PNAS paper on this topic?
No, I don't think so.
I haven't dissected.
Maybe that's what was being talked about on Twitter.
It could be. So it was making the rounds recently. I have not dissected it thoroughly, but basically the gist of it is what they found by analyzing a large corpus of literature across many fields is that as any given field of science gets bigger, as measured by like the total number of papers being published, the field basically moves slower. And I believe the measure for that was like there was, as the field gets bigger, there's more and more inequality. The Gini coefficient of the citations goes up, meaning that people just keep citing the same pool of like mega papers, and effectively, the ideas really do become entrenched by that measure, at least.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really interesting concept. Yeah, and
you see this in the private.
You can't keep up with the volume of research anymore. I used to know all of the cannabinoid researchers. A paper would come out, and I knew the names. And now there's so much stuff. I get these alerts from PubMed. There's so much research coming out. I can't keep track of it all because it's coming out, faster than I can read and digest. And I don't know any of the people anymore. So I definitely feel like I'm losing a handle of some parts of the research, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah. When I fantasize about this stuff, sometimes, I imagine an alternate universe where, an academic is not applying for a grant like every goddamn year over and over again, but an individual is simply awarded like a perpetual grant, say. And, for the next 25 years, you're going to just go do your thing. And this is it's sort of like you're getting 25 years worth of grants all at once as an individual, rather than having to have a different group of your peers justify this one set of experiments twice a year, every year ad infinitum.
Yeah. And we waste a lot of our time writing grants. I felt like that was one of the most unproductive uses of my time, writing grants that didn't get funded, rewriting them, just that whole process. It takes more time than it's worth.
Yeah.
And
it really does in many ways remind me of the private sector, in the sense that, when you talk about disruptive innovation, right, the story is always, the small unknown startup disrupting the incumbent, because as organizations get bigger, whether it's government, whether it's a corporation, whether it's, our academic institutions, there's just more administrative structure there, and it just sucks away time from the actual thing you're trying to do, and you just move slower.
Yeah.